of the intellect, the aspects which are characteristic in the rhetorical figure, and likewise also in every rhetorical and poetic period, can become more scientific. The rhetorical device strikes the ear as much as the intellect. It can be exploited in logic to the benefit of the use of human mental faculties, primarily to foster knowledge and discoveries.
We now have a coffee break and we will reconvene at 11:15. Thank you.
So, let us start this afternoon session. Our first speaker is the person who we are only elected for this conference, testifying and testifying in practice.
I'm afraid that after the performances of this morning, my talk will be very boring and long enough, so I apologize for that. The narrative and non-narrative play different roles in knowledge. Così si sente? How does one characterize and classify them and their role? This is a basic logic task. First, Ivan states that the chief business of the logician is to classify arguments. Oddly enough, however, this is a somewhat underdeveloped subject. What can be termed as a standard classification of inferences is stated by Etica and Sam in a recent textbook as follows. Inferences can be either deductive, that is necessarily observing, or imperative, that is not necessarily preserving. The standard classification of inferences, however, is inadequate because there are inferences that are neither deductive nor imperative. An example is provided by abductive inferences. It is widely held that one of the main means to obtain a hypothesis is abduction. That is, the inference rule A, B implies A, B. For example, Josephson, in his book on abduction, states that abduction is a form of inference that grows from data describing something to a hypothesis. It includes the whole process of generation, criticism, and possible acceptance of an explanatory hypothesis. This is what Josephson says. Of course, abductive inferences are not necessarily representative. If A is true and B is false, then B implies A is true. So the premises of abduction are true and the conclusion is false. Since abductive inferences are not necessarily self-preserving, in terms of the standard classification of inferences, one should conclude that they are imperative. In fact, Josephson states that abductions are imperative inferences, namely, through them you may have more information than we had before. The abduction transcends the information of its premises and generates new information that was not previously included there at all. While the deductive inferences are truth preserving, according to Josephson, successful abductions make sense to be truth producing. The conclusion that abductive inferences are imperative, however, is in conflict with the fact that in an inference obtained by abduction, the conclusion B is a subformula of the premise B implies A. Thus, a hypothesis B obtained by abduction is already contained in the premise B implies A. Therefore, contrary to Goethe's claim, abduction does not transcend information on its premises, generating new information not previously included there. New information is not generated by abduction, but rather by the process that yields the premise B implies A. Therefore, abductive inferences are non-imperative. Since abductive inferences are both non-imperative and not necessarily truth-preserving, they provide a counterexample to the standard classification of the inferences. On the other hand, like deductive on one end, like deductive inferences, abductive inferences are not applicative. On the other hand, like non-deductive inferences, they are not necessary to preserving. Even Peirce, who first stated the adoption, ended up acknowledging that adoptive inferences are not applicative. Peirce states adoption as follows. The surprising fact C is observed that if A were true, C would be a matter of course, hence there is reason to suspect that A is true. As then explains, thus A cannot be abductively inferred, or if you prefer the expression, cannot be abductively conjectured until its entire content is already present in the premise. If A were true, C would be a matter of course. This Peirce goes on, provides an argument to show that quite new conceptions cannot be obtained from the In this way, Peirce admits that in abductive inference with premise C and A by C, the conclusion A, the entire content of conclusion is already present in the premise A by C. So, abductive inference are not applicative. Peirce also admits that new information is not produced by abductive inference, but rather by the process which yields the premise A by C. According to Peirce, however, such premise or such process is a non-inferential one, being based on intuition. For Peirce states that the suggestion of the premise A by C comes to us like a flash. It is an act of insight, although extremely fallible insight. The different elements of the hypothesis were in our mind before, but it is the idea of putting them together which flashes the new suggestion before contemplation. This suggestion is, says Peirce, the result of a process, although a process which is not controllable and therefore not fully conscious. Rather, it is a subconscious process. According to Peirce, such process cannot be subjected to logical analysis. For a logical analysis, Peirce maintains, would be terminated in what that analysis would represent as an abductive inference, resting on the result of a similar process, which a similar logical analysis would represent to be terminated by similar abductive inference, and so on, ad infinitum. Therefore, according to Peirce, logic analysis would fail for the very same reason for which Achilles' chase for the tortoise fails. Just as Achilles does not have to make the series of distant endeavors, which is represented as making, so, Peirce maintains, this process of forming the judgment A by C, being subconscious and so not amenable to logical criticism, doesn't have to make separate parts of inference. Therefore, Peirce distinguishes between the act of insight yielding the premise A by C, which is creative and subconscious, and abductive inference, which is non-creative and conscious. Abductive inference are inferences, and according to Peirce, in an inference we should be conscious, not only of the conclusion and of our deliberate approval, but also this being the result of the premises. An inference is essentially deliberate and self-controlled. Being self-controlled, abductive inference cannot be created, because self-control of any kind, according to Peirce, is purely clinical. It originates nothing. Peirce claimed that the process of forming the judgment Peirce claims that the process of forming the judgment A implies B must be subconscious and based on an atom inside. This assumption depends on his argument that such proofs cannot be subjected to analysis. The analytic method provides a counterexample to Peirce's argument because it gives a logical analysis of the process of hypothesis formation in terms of conscious inferences. I will not discuss this question here. What is important here is only that Peirce acknowledges that adaptive inferences are not reality. Adaptive inferences provide a counterexample not only to the standard classification of inferences, but also to Peirce's own classification of inferences. Peirce states that inferences may be divided into deductive or analytic, that is, not empirical, and synthetic, namely empirical. In turn, according to Peirce, synthetic inferences may be divided into induction and hypothesis. Thus, Peirce classifies all inferences as follows: inference, deductive, synthetic, and then induction, hypothesis. By hypothesis, Peirce means what later he will call induction. This appears from his own example of hypothesis. The example is as follows: all the pins from this bag are white, and these bags are white. Therefore, these pins are from this bag. Adaptive inferences are a counterexample to Peirce's classification of inferences because they are non-empirical, thus non-synthetic. Peirce's later admission that adaptive inferences are non-empirical contrasts with this classification of inference. The explanation is that the paper in which he maintains that induction is non-empirical is a paper of 1903, is the Harvard Lectures on Pragmatism, whereas this classification is in 1817, a paper deduction induction hypothesis. Simply, Peirce changed his mind. There is another problem with Peirce's classification of inferences. While originally, Peirce does not sharply distinguish the roles of induction and deduction, later on, he considers abduction as a means to introduce new hypotheses and induction as a means to verify them. Indeed, he states that abduction furnishes the reasoner with a problematic theory, which then induction verifies. Induction is the experimental testing of a theory, so it never can originate any idea whatever. But consider induction as a means to verify hypotheses seems actually plausible. For scientific hypotheses are typically universal, so no number of experiments can verify them. Since adaptive inferences provide a counterexample to the standard classification of inferences, an alternative classification is needed. To that end, I will divide all inferences into empirical and non-empirical. Empirical inferences consist of non-deductive inferences and are not necessary to preserve. Non-empirical inferences, in turn, are divided into deductive and abductive, where the former are truth-preserving, the latter are not necessarily preserving. From this diagram, it appears why the standard classification of inferences is inadequate. Adaptive inferences are both non-empirical and not necessary to preserve. The only adequate classification of inferences is in terms of empiricity rather than truth preservation. That non-deductive inferences are not necessary to truth preserving is a consequence of their being empirical. On the other hand, deductive inferences are truth preserving because they sacrifice empiricity. Their conclusion contains no more, in fact, usually less, than was implicitly contained in premises. The conclusion is only a reformulation of all or part of the content of the premises. Adaptive inferences belong to a different category because, on the one hand, like deductive inference, they are non-empirical. On the other hand, unlike them, they are not necessarily preserving. Open question. It is an open question whether, in addition to inference obtained by the adoption, adaptive inference, I mean inference non-empirical and not necessarily preserving, however, requires some refinement. So provided, we must discuss the justification of the inference. Several justifications of the deductive rules have been proposed. I will consider two especially significant ones: the third functional justification and the inferential justification. According to the third functional justification, the deductive rules are justified because they are truth preserving. This is the original justification by Frege, who states that the justification of exponents is from the proposition delta implies gamma and delta we may infer gamma. For if gamma were not the true, then since delta is the true, delta implies gamma would be the false. Such a justification, however, as we know, is circular. For example, the justification of those exponents is of the following form. Suppose that A and A implies B are true. Now, if A is true, then if A implies B is true, then B is true. Since A and A implies B are true, from this, by two application of model exponents, we conclude that B is true. This justification of model exponents uses model exponents, so it is circular. Against the conclusion that the truth functional justification of the deductive rules is circular, two objections might be raised. First objection: the circularity involved in the truth functional justification of the deductive rules is not premise circularity, which is harmful, but rule circularity, which is harmless. Premise circularity occurs when the fact that the deductive rule is truth preserving is used as a premise in the justification of that rule. On the contrary, rule circularity occurs when the deductive rule is used in the course of the justification of that rule. According to this view, premise circularity is harmful because the premise circular justification of the deductive rule has no force for anyone who does not already accept that such a deductive rule is truth preserving. On the other hand, rule circularity is harmless because the rule circular justification of the deductive rule is not intended to persuade anyone of the truth of the conclusion of the deductive rule, but only to explain why the conclusion is true. This objection, however, is untenable, for if a rule circularity is allowed, then one can give a truth functional justification not only for model exponents, which is truth preserving, but also for induction, which is not necessarily preserving. The truth functional justification of induction is as follows. Suppose that A and B implies A are true. Now, if A is true, then B implies A is true. But on the other hand, B implies A is true. Now, since these two formulas are true, then by application of induction, we conclude that B is true. It is no use to say that this is not genuine justification of induction because while the functional justification of model exponents uses model exponents, which is truth preserving, this justification use of induction uses induction, which is not necessarily preserving. For to justify that model exponents is truth preserving is just the question at issue here, so we cannot assume. Second objection. The truth functional justification of model exponents involves use of model exponents in the meta-language, while the model exponents being justified concerns the object language. So the rule being justified and the justifying rule are on different levels. This objection too is untenable, for how do we justify the model exponents of the meta-language? We justify it by demonstrating that it is truth preserving, and we justify it using model exponents in the language. The same question would then arise for the latter, and so on, ad infinitum. Thus, we cannot argue that model exponents is truth preserving without progress. Moreover, the objection overlooks that if by use of model exponents in the meta-language we can justify use of model exponents in the object language, then, as we have seen, by use of induction in the meta-language we can justify use of induction in the object language. Thus, if model exponents is justified function 2 is justified, we conclude that the third functional justification of the data force is none. Let us consider now the inferential justification. According to an inferential justification, the introduction rules are self-justifying, and the elimination rules are justified by reference to them. For example, Goethe, the originator of this justification, in his famous paper, states that the introduction represents, as it were, the definitions of the symbol concerned, and the eliminations are no more than the formalities that consequence of these definitions. It is, in eliminating a symbol, we may use the formula with whose terminal symbol we are dealing, only in the sense afforded it by the introduction of the symbol. For example, we're able to introduce the formula A plus B when there existed a derivation of B from the assumed formula A. If we then wish to use that formula by eliminating the implication symbol, we could do this precisely by inferring B directly once A has been proved. For what A plus B attests is thus the existence of a derivation of B from A. This justification tool is circular. For example, the justification of modus ponens or implication elimination given by Goethe is as follows. Suppose we have derivations of A and A plus B. By Goethe's definition of A plus B, we were able to introduce A plus B when there existed a derivation of B from the assumption A. We then obtain a derivation of B, replacing the assumption A in such a derivation by the given derivation of A. So, on the assumption that we have derivations of A and A plus B, we obtain a derivation of B as shown in this conversion. Now, such justification of implication elimination is circular because it is of the following form. Suppose we have derivations of A and A plus B. If we have derivations of A and derivation of A plus B, then by the definition of A plus B, we have a derivation from the assumption A. If we have a derivation of B from the assumption A, from the latter and the given derivation of A, we obtain a derivation of B. Then, by complications of implication elimination, we obtain a derivation of B. This justification of implication elimination uses implication elimination, so it's circular. Moreover, if implication elimination is justified because if we have derivations of A and A implies B, we can obtain the derivation of B, then abduction 2 can be justified in the same way. In fact, this is what Peirce does. Peirce, as an example of abduction, considers Kepler's argument concerning Mars orbit, which he calls the greatest piece of abductive ever recorded. Kepler, maintains Peirce, found that the observed longitudes of Mars were such as they would be if Mars moved in minutes. Then, from the observed fact A of the longitudes of Mars, Peirce, Kepler, inferred the hypothesis B, that Mars moved in an east. From this he concluded that if the hypothesis B were true, the fact A would be a matter of course, namely B by C. So, by his definition of A being by C, Kepler was able to introduce B in by C when there existed a derivation of A. Thus, the derivation of B from B by C, according to Kepler, could be put in the following form. A introduction abduction rule. From A we can derive B, therefore B by C. From this, we may then obtain the derivation of B by means of the following conversion, where for uniformity I rename abduction as abduction elimination. As you see, we apply this conversion in the conclusion. Thus, from the assumption that we have derivations of A and B by C, we can obtain the derivation of B. We conclude that inferential justification of the data is not. It could be shown that all other justifications of the data rules which are known today are wrong. In inadequacy of all scientific justification depends on the fact that they take no account of the role of deductive inferences in knowledge. Only by taking this into account, one can give a justification of the truth. To give a justification, we must first explain what we mean by justification. In this regard, it is convenient to use final distinction between two kinds of justification: validation and vindication. Validation, according to Fiber, is justification in the sense of an argument concerning validating grounds. Vindication is justification in the sense of an argument concerning means with respect to ends. Therefore, to validate an inference rule is to demonstrate that it can be derived from some other inference rules. On the other hand, to vindicate an inference rule is to demonstrate that it is adequate to a certain end. Since to validate a deductive rule is to demonstrate that it can be derived from all deductive rules, not all deductive rules can be validated. Otherwise, there would be an infinite race or a repetition circle. Therefore, there must be some ultimate deductive rules which cannot be validated. For such ultimate deductive rules, one can only seek vindication. Namely, one can only try to demonstrate that they are adequate to a certain end. The question is, to what end? Five's answer is that they are adequate to the end to deduce true propositions from true premises. This answer, however, is inadequate because, as we have seen, we cannot demonstrate that modus ponens is adequate to the end of truth presentation without singularity, and the same applies to any other ultimate rule. Therefore, we cannot demonstrate that the ultimate deductive rules are adequate to the end. Moreover, seeking to vindicate the ultimate deductive rules with respect to the end of truth presentation takes no account of the role of deductive inferences in knowledge, for it overlooks that the premises on which our knowledge is based are not true, they can only be plausible. We say that the premise is plausible if it is compatible with the existing data, in the sense that comparing the arguments for and the arguments against the premise on the premises on the basis of the existing data, the arguments for prevail over against. Plausible premises, in a sense, correspond to what Aristotle calls endoxa, or accepted opinions. To explain on what grounds opinions are accepted, Aristotle states that for each opinion we must examine the arguments for and the arguments against. Then, accepted opinion, endoxa, are what they call plausible statement. Because accepted opinions are opinions such that compare the arguments for and the arguments against on the basis of existing data, the arguments for are stronger than those against. Since the premises on which our knowledge is based are not true but can only be plausible, the end to deduce true propositions from true premises is an empty one. Thus, the role of deductive inference in knowledge cannot be to deduce true propositions from true premises. This suggests that in the alternative classification of inference given earlier, truth preservation must be replaced by plausibility preservation. We can truth preserving, so substitute the plausibility preserving scheme. The distinction between plausibility preserving and not necessarily plausibility preserving is essentially different from that between truth preserving and not necessarily preserving. While the latter is not experience dependent, since truth is defined in terms of mathematical models, the former is experience dependent because plausibility is defined in terms of compatibility with existing data of experience. In terms of this classification of inferences, we can give a vindication of the ultimate deductive rules with respect to the following end, A, to make explicit the content or part of the content that is implicit that the ultimate deductive rules can be vindicated with respect to the same follows from an analysis of the premises which shows that the conclusion is implicit. For example, that modus ponens can be vindicated with respect to the exam follows from simple observation the conclusion is sub-formula of the major premise. The fact that the ultimate deductive rules can be vindicated with respect to the A is consistent with the claim that always taking into account the role of deductive inferences in knowledge, one can give a justification of such inference. For such role, knowledge is just A. Deductive inferences are non-applied, but that doesn't mean that they play no useful role in knowledge. Since the conclusion makes explicit the content or part of the content that is only implicit in premises, to establish that the conclusion is plausible facilitates the comparison of the premises with experience. Therefore, the NA agrees with the role of deductive inference in knowledge. However, that the ultimate deductive rules can be vindicated with respect to the NA does not ensure by itself that any specific deductive inference is useful. For a deductive inference to be useful, one must know that its premises are plausible. This ensures that the conclusion is plausible for deductive rules, being non-objective are plausibility preserved. Since for a deductive inference to be useful, one must know that its premises are plausible, the usefulness of deductive rules essentially depends on a comparison with experience, so with something external to inference. So inferences are not self-justifying. Let us consider now non-deductive rules. Several justifications of them have been proposed. I will consider only a special significant one, the intuitional justification. According to the intuitional justification, non-deductive rules are justified because they ultimately rest on intuition. For example, Kyborg states that our justification of inductive rules must rest on an irrevocable element of inductive intuition. Kyborg goes on saying that when we see that if all we know about the world is that all the A's we have seen have been B's, it is rational to expect that the next A will be a B. Such justification of the non-deductive rules, however, is subject to limitation that intuition is followed. Because of this, some of its supporters, such as Karma, replace infallible justification by fallible justification. But, as Karma acknowledges, they are faced with the problem that the intuitive plausibility of a non-deductive inference, Karma say, may be more or less strong, and in the course of development of a system, there may be a progress by an increase in plausibility. Sometimes, Karma goes on, a non-deductive inference is inflated by one or several more plausible non-deductive inferences, or, for a given non-deductive inference, more plausible reasons are found. Then, the justification of non-deductive rules depends on plausibility, and plausibility is based on argument, not on intuition. Therefore, the intuitional justification of non-deductive rules is none. It could be shown that all other justifications of non-deductive rules that have been proposed are also inadequate. Here again, the inadequacy of such justification depends on the fact that they take no account of the role of non-deductive inferences in knowledge. To give a justification of non-deductive rules, again, find a distinction between validation and vindication is useful. Since to validate a non-deductive rule is to demonstrate that it can be derived from other non-deductive rules, not all deductive rules can be validated, otherwise they could be so simple. Therefore, there must be some ultimate non-deductive rules that cannot be validated. For such ultimate non-deductive rules, one can only seek an indication, namely, one can only try to demonstrate that they are ultimate to a certain end. The classification of inferences into appiative and non-appiative inferences suggests a vindication of the ultimate non-deductive rules with respect to the following end. B. To discover hypothesis. That the ultimate non-deductive rules can be vindicated with respect to the MB follows from an analysis to conclusion, which shows that the conclusion of a non-deductive inference contains something not contained in the premises. This is essential for discovery. The fact that the ultimate non-deductive rules can be vindicated with respect to the same is consistent with the claim that only by taking into account the role of non-deductive inference in knowledge, one can give a justification of such inference, for such role is thus to discover hypothesis. Non-deductive inferences are imperative because their conclusion essentially goes beyond the premises. For such reason, they provide a basis for discovery. Therefore, the MBA agrees with the role of non-deductive inference in knowledge. That the ultimate non-deductive rules can be vindicated with respect to descent, however, does not ensure that any specific non-deductive inference is useful. For a non-deductive inference to be useful, one must know that both its premises and conclusion are plausible. To know that its premises are plausible is not enough, because non-deductive rules are not necessarily possibilities of assertion. Since for a non-deductive inference to be useful, one must know that both its premises and conclusion are plausible, the usefulness of non-deductive rules essentially depends on a comparison with experience, so with something external to inference. So again, non-deductive rules are not self-justifying. Let me consider finally abduction. Since abductive inference are non-empiric, abduction cannot be vindicated with respect to the MB to discover hypothesis. Like the deductive rules, it can be vindicated only with respect to an A to make explicit the content or part of the content that is implicit in the premise. To establish that abduction is adequate to the A, we need knowledge itself that conclusion is transformed of the premise. It is commonly held that there is an asymmetry between deductive and non-deductive rules. The common opinion is that while deductive rules can be justified, non-deductive rules cannot be justified. For example, Salmon states that if we reflect upon a deductive rule, such as the respondents, we cannot conceive the possibility of any situation in which it's useful from premises to false conclusion. So, we can find no grounds whatever for withholding the judgment that modus ponens is to the server. On the contrary, according to Salmon, non-deductive rules cannot be justified because we can, without difficulty, imagine all sorts of states of affairs in which practically all, if not absolutely all, further inductive inferences to premises do not well false conclusions. Let us call this the asymmetry view. However common, the asymmetry view is a warrant because the justification of deductive and non-deductive rules raises a similar problem and can be approached much in the same way. This appears from the following three facts. First fact, there must be both some ultimate deductive and non-deductive rules that cannot be validated. For such rules, one can only see vindication. B, both deductive and non-deductive rules can be vindicated with respect to the end, to an end that agrees with the rule of knowledge. For deductive rules can be vindicated with respect to the end A, which is the error. Non-deductive rules can be vindicated with respect to the end B, which is the rule of knowledge. C, the usefulness of both deductive and non-deductive rules essentially depends on a comparison with experience, so with something external to inference. These facts suggest a symmetry rather than an asymmetry between deductive and rules. What is the origin of the asymmetry view? A number of people have maintained that the origin of this view is to be found in Cellucci theory. But I think it's not enough. For Cellucci papers produce an argument for the impossibility of any criterion of truth, which immediately yields an argument for the impossibility of validating all inference views, both deductive and non-deductive. Cellucci's empirical argument is as follows. Those who profess to judge the truth are bound to have a criterion. Now, this criterion of truth either is not judged upon or as a judged upon. If it is not judged upon, then it cannot be trusted, for no matter what is to be trusted without judging. If it has been judged upon, that which judges it term either has been judged upon or has not been judged upon, and so on, as infinitum. If we interpret criterion of truth as inference, then status empiricus argument becomes those who profess to validate an inference rule are bound to use some inference rule to validate it. Now, this inference rule either is not validated or has been validated. If it is not validated, then it cannot be trusted, for the matter of distance is to be trusted without being validated. If it has been validated, then the inference rules used to validate the term either has been validated or has not been validated, and so on. By this argument, it is impossible to validate all inference rules, deductive or non-deductive. So, there must be some ultimate deductive and non-deductive rules which cannot be validated. In view of this symmetry between deductive and non-deductive inferences, the origin of the asymmetry cannot be attributed. The origin of the asymmetry view, in my view, is rather to be attributed to Hume. Hume's argument about induction is that induction cannot be justified demonstratively, since it implies a contradiction that the course of nature may change. Induction can be justified only inductively, or as it says, by experience. But to justify it by experience is back into question. For all inferences from experience, suppose a their foundation that the future will resemble the past, and that similar powers will be conjoined with similar sensible qualities. It is impossible, therefore, that any arguments from experience can prove this resemblance of the past and future, since all these arguments are founded on the supposition of resemblance. If one claims that an argument from experience can prove it, then, you conclude, it must be identical. In this way, Hume's argument is that induction might be justified only inductively, but such justification is impossible because the purported justification, being itself inductive, would be silly. From this it appears that Hume's argument about induction is simply a special case of Cestus Empiricus argument. As Weintraub states, Hume wasn't the first to cast doubt on the form of inference we call inductive, neither was his argument original, initial axis standard. Even the terminology is due to Cestus Empiricus rather than Hume, for while Cestus Empiricus used the term epagoge, induction, Hume used the terms experimental, experience, causal to refer to inductive arguments. Moreover, Cestus Empiricus argument applies both to deductive and non-deductive rules. On the contrary, Hume applies his argument only to induction. This raises two questions. Why does Hume apply his argument only to induction, refraining from extending it to induction? Second question. Since Hume's argument was not original, what was Hume's contribution? As to one, Hume distinguished two kinds of justification, intuitional and inferential. Then, he distinguished two kinds of inferential justification, demonstrative and inductive. Now, for Hume, no inferential justification of deduction is possible. For, on the one hand, no demonstrative justification of deduction is possible, since such justification would have to use those very same deductive rules that have been justified. But, as Hume states, the same principle cannot be both the cause and the effect of an object. On the other hand, no inductive justification of deduction is possible because induction itself cannot be justified. Since for you, no inferential justification of deduction is possible, but on the other hand, it does not claim that deduction cannot be justified, we may conclude that it tacitly assumes an intuitional justification of deduction. Namely, it tacitly assumes that the validity of deductive inferences is, as it says, discoverable at first sight. So, the recognition of the validity of deductive inference fails under the province of intuition, as it says. Then the reason why Hume applies his argument only to induction is that it tacitly assumes that deduction has an intuitional justification. justification. This assumption has widely shared since you. For example, Carl states that our justification of the deductive rules must ultimately rest in part on an element of deductive intuition. We see that modus ponens is preserving. This is seen to the same as to reflect on it, then fail to see how it affects. Such assumption, however, does not seem to be plausible. The intuitional justification of an action is inadequate for the very same reason why the intuitional justification of an action is inadequate. Namely, intuition is fallible, and if one replaces the fallible intuition with a fallible intuition, one is confronted with the problem that the justification of the rules ultimately depend on possibility, which is based on argument and intuition. As to two, Hume's contribution consists in the asymmetry view. According to Hume, while deduction as an intuitional justification, the ground for inductive inference is not intuitive. Hume has strongly influenced the talk about induction, but this contribution does not consist in his argument about induction, as we have seen that argument is just a special case of Cellucci's empirical argument. His contribution consists rather in the asymmetry view. Deductive rules can be justified, while non-deductive rules cannot be justified. The asymmetry view, however, is unjustified because, as we have seen, the justification of non-deductive rules raises a similar problem as the justification of the rules, and can be approached in much the same way. But if the asymmetry view is unjustified, there is no such thing as the problem of induction. For them, there is nothing distinctly perplexing about induction as opposed to induction.
Now follows immediately oral questions. Discussion. So after that, okay.
Hello everyone. I must confess that my comments on Cellucci's paper were motivated by my reading of some of these draft chapters related to a book project called What is Really Logic, or What is Logic Really? Okay, in this paper of today, Cellucci discusses two assumptions underlying the standard or traditional classification of inferences, which are deeply interconnected. On the one hand, the inferences are either deductive or ampliative, which is a yes or no question, either deductive or non-deductive. Secondly, there is an asymmetry between deductive and inductive inferences. In my comments, I will focus on the second aspect, on the idea of asymmetry. And I will have first a historical section on this view concerning Hume. I'm going to contradict Cellucci's reading by focusing on the treatise, on the young Hume, where I argue that actually the young Hume was extremely radical in his arguments and called into question both forms of inferences in the traditional sense. Okay, and then towards the end I will conclude with some observations so that it becomes clear how this relates to Cellucci's project, according to the way I understand it. Okay, the classical way of thinking about induction, the propositional approach. Is that clear enough? Yeah. Okay. The classical way of thinking about induction conceives of it as analogous to, but weaker than, deductive reasoning. Both sorts of reasoning
are understood to be logical relations between propositions. Both allow one to form arguments from premises to conclusions. But in opposition to deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning is ambiguous in the sense that the conclusion goes beyond the content of the premises, whereas the conclusion of the correct deductive argument is only either as strong or weaker than the premises. According to the classical scheme, deductive reasoning seems uninteresting from the point of view of acquiring new knowledge, but it has the advantage of being truth-preserving, and in this sense it is logically reliable. If the premises are true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true, while in the case of inductive reasoning, the premises only support the conclusion, making it more or less plausible at a given time, but leaving some uncertainty as to the truth of the conclusions at some future time. Accordingly, what came to be known as the problem of induction appears as nothing but the fact that inductive inferences are not logically reliable, that is, they're not truth-preserving. Now, most modern philosophical thought about induction and scientific inquiry is still gripped by Hume's problem of induction. But the question is, were these conclusions drawn by Hume concerning the goal of inquiry, that is, the advancement of learning? It is worth noting that in Hume's case, the so-called problem of induction itself appeared as the outcome of the strictures imposed by the deductive paradigm underlying the classical view of scientific demonstration. Against this backdrop, Hume's arguments may be viewed as a radical challenge to the classical scheme. Moreover, such a challenge is the culmination of a critical movement that acquired force in the early 17th century. So let us briefly turn to the history of the classical view of science from the perspective of some of its critics. On the Aristotelian view of science, scientific knowledge is justified by its internal deductive structure. It is part of this classical view that scientific knowledge ought to be demonstrative. Indeed, the paradigmatic examples of genuine causal demonstrations were to be found in the formal sciences. The examples offered by Aristotle came from Euclid's geometry or Euclidean geometry, where the proofs were required to be ostensive, that means direct. This requirement was important. Only direct proofs follow the classical a priori order of reasoning from axioms to conclusions. Such proofs, called causal proofs, possess certain epistemic virtue in the sense that they are truly explanatory. They were supposed to be truly explanatory. Four different notions of cause were in play, and this terminology was also applied to mathematical demonstrations. To discuss the virtues of certain types of mathematical proofs in terms of the causality of proofs was still common usage among 17th century mathematicians such as Wallace, Descartes, and Leibniz. In order to satisfy the said requirements, the classical view of science needs to make two basic assumptions. Firstly, there is the assumption of the deductive explanatory order of truth, axioms or general principles, that can be taken as ultimate reasons underlying causal proofs. Secondly, there is the assumption of an idealized cognitive agent who is able to comprehend the crucial deductive relations. The relationship between inductive and deductive reasoning is, around that time, was deeply entangled with discussion of analysis and synthesis, and this relates to complex issues in the history of science. Let us focus here on the discussion as it appears in the early 17th century, when methodological issues were of relevance to the emergence of the new science, in particular particular analytic geometry, the issue of learning and discovery was one of the most important methodological issues being discussed at the time. Descartes, for instance, argued against the Aristotelian view of science and logic. His goal was to establish methodological norms for the direction of a new type of rational inquirer. Such rules were conceived of as methodological procedures for the resolution of problems by means of analysis. Descartes criticized both the axiomatic method of the ancient geometers for not providing insight into the actual procedure of inquiry used by them, and traditional logic for teaching rules that were unable to offer any useful guide for acquiring new truth. On Descartes' view, the rules of traditional methodology, both in science and logic, were an obstacle for those interested in learning and acquiring new knowledge. Like Wallace and other 17th century mathematicians, he complained that the axiomatic form of textbook presentation of classical geometry did not show the true way of discovery, the method of analysis, which had been used for generating the results. What was being called into question at the time is thus the epistemic primacy of deductive structure, both in mathematical practice and scientific textbook exposition. Descartes refused to use the axiomatic form of presentation in his Geometry, 1637, claiming that his analytical proofs did not require a synthetic validation. According to Descartes, his proofs are truly explanatory because they show the way the results were obtained, which is what is required for understanding those results. Much to the confusion of scholars, Descartes decided to turn around the classical terminology and call the analytical proofs, his analytical proofs, a priori and causal proofs, while in the classical terminology, analysis was associated with induction, that is to say, the a posteriori non-demonstrative order of reasoning. To sum up, the different lines of attack launched by the 17th century critics were united by the perception that the classical deductive scheme was useless for those interested in learning something new. This critical movement reached its culmination in the next century when, against the backdrop of Newton's contribution to a new science, Hume renewed the attack. Hume's main target was twofold, and I'm basing now my observations on the treatise, his early work. His target was twofold. On the one hand, Hume calls into question the idea of a causal explanatory order of true principles waiting to be discovered by an omniscient agent. On the other hand, he radically challenges the assumption of an unbounded cognitive agent able to reliably relate to such objective principles, establishing necessary and infallible connections which would be required for learning and understanding science according to the classical scheme. Note that Hume does not speak or never speaks of the problem of induction. When first presenting his challenge in the treatise, he attacks the classical conception of general principles as ultimate reasons which may be discovered without consulting any form of experience. And he assumed a rather sophisticated notion of experience in that context, not the basic idea of just sense data. Hume's main objection against the classical perspective is that causal relations in general were conceived of as a type of logical relation of deducibility. At this early stage of his career, Hume thus poses his radical challenge to the classical inquirer to Goethe, for there is no reason to assume that perceptually bounded agents like us should have unbounded and infallible domain of inquiry. In this sense, there is no asymmetry between deductive and inductive reasoning for the young Hume, as both forms of reasoning face similar objections according to the critic. Now, to sum up this section, the 17th century witnessed the divorce between the classical paradigm of demonstrative knowledge and logic and the methodology of science. Later on, towards the mid or the end of 19th century, the axiomatic paradigm experienced a powerful revival in a different context, in the context of foundational studies, which focus on mathematical logic knowledge, thus leading to a new form, to the new, what we call to the mathematical logic, the new mathematical logic. So it is this form of mathematical logic that Cellucci is calling into question. All the same, I suggest that in his arguments against mathematical logic, Cellucci is rehearsing, mutatis mutandis, of course, some of the 17th century arguments against the classical view of logic and knowledge. In particular, he argues, sometimes in very striking, similar lines, he argues that logic is bound to remain a rather sterile enterprise with no impact upon scientific practice unless we make room for an alternative view of the discipline. He calls it a logic of discovery. So I have this little section to close. I titled Cellucci on the futures of an alternative logic paradigm. Okay? So what does the alternative view look like? How does the alternative view look like? Well, from what I understand, this alternative view recommends revisiting the relation between logic and knowledge. While the classical paradigm, now the classical paradigm in a broad sense, including the axiomatic system in the way it's used in modern mathematical logic or in the foundational studies, while the classical paradigm conceives of logic as a means to systematize and justify the body of existing knowledge, the alternative view sees logic as contributing to discovery and learning on the basis of what is already known, while the first one, the classical paradigm, confines the mind to the systematization and justification of the body of knowledge, of the body of already established knowledge. The second one, this alternative paradigm Cellucci seems to have in mind, looks forward to the future, for it sees old truth as something to be tested again and again by new experiences and used in further inquiries. This idea goes back to Dewey, as Hershey pointed to it in this morning lecture. Okay, so secondly, this alternative view suggests then, or it follows from this first point, from the revisiting the relation between logic and knowledge. From this it follows that the alternative view requires a different way of looking at the relation between logic and method. It aims at re-establishing the interconnection between the method of science and logic. Methodological tools and logical tools ought not to be separated. The alternative view Cellucci has in mind is based on the alternative view Cellucci has in mind is based on fundamental cognitive capabilities. The practice of science shows that in the final analysis, logic as mathematical work, in particular, is based on problem-solving capabilities, these being the most basic human capabilities. Finally, where the prevailing view of logic focuses exclusively on the epistemic value of justificatory uses of proofs. Cellucci is interested in emphasizing problem-solving practices and the fruitfulness of new ideas, all aspects most relevant to the analytic method. In this context, the relation between finding and proving results, which would correspond to discovery and justification, consists in a strictly dynamic relationship which has to be seen in each specific context of research. In particular, he emphasizes the variety of our practices of proof and refutations and of deductive, inductive, and abductive forms of reasoning. Finally, we find some challenging points that are of current interest. For instance, why should we think of inductive inference in analogy with the classical deductive scheme? Does it make sense to formalize inference? What are the limits of formalization? Can all forms of reasoning be reduced to and explicitly stated in linear, one-dimensional discursive text? What about visualization and other forms of flow and storage of information? These are all questions which come to mind. I would like to see more about how to flesh out some of these ideas.